The recent tensions troubled him deeply. His young warriors grew restless with each passing season, watching their hunting grounds shrink as more wagons arrived from the east. They spoke of their grandfathers' victories, of times when Apache warriors struck fear into their enemies' hearts. But Running Bear remembered those wars and the rivers of blood they had cost both sides. "The whites multiply like grasshoppers," said Lone Wolf, his nephew and most vocal critic. "They consume everything in their path. Soon there will be nothing left for our children." Running Bear understood the young man's anger. He had watched the buffalo herds thin, seen sacred places plowed under and fenced off. The promises made by the blue-coat soldiers at Fort Apache seemed as fragile as morning frost. Yet he also remembered the winter his own daughter had died of the white man's fever, and how Dr. Morrison from the settlement had ridden through a blizzard to try to save her, asking for nothing in return. "Hatred is like fire," Running Bear would tell his warriors. "It can warm you or burn you depending on how you tend it." The incident with the white boy had crystallized everything. Young Tommy Brennan had fallen into Raven's Canyon while setting his snares too close to Apache territory. Swift Hawk and Grey Wolf had found him, his leg broken and fever beginning to claim him. Without hesitation, they had carried him to safety, tended his wounds with healing herbs, and returned him to his people. But instead of gratitude, they had been met with suspicion and fear. Some settlers spoke of the rescue as a trick, claiming the Apache had taken the boy in the first place. Others whispered that it was a sign of weakness, that the tribe was trying to avoid a fight they couldn't win. "They see treachery where we show mercy," Grey Wolf reported to the council. "Their hearts are closed like winter lodges." Running Bear studied his translator nephew, noting the frustration in his voice. Grey Wolf had learned English from missionaries and often served as a bridge between worlds. He was perhaps the only Apache who truly understood both cultures, and the knowledge sometimes weighed heavily upon him. "Fear makes people see enemies in shadows," Running Bear replied. "But it also makes them hungry for truth, even when they don't realize it." That was why he had agreed to Samuel Whitman's proposal for a peace council, not because he believed words could solve everything, but because he sensed an opportunity to plant seeds of understanding that might grow into something lasting. The spirits had been speaking to him in dreams, showing him visions of a different future, where his grandchildren might live without the constant threat of war. The sacred meeting ground chosen for the council held deep significance for his people. Generations of Apache had gathered there to settle disputes and make important decisions. The spring that bubbled up from the earth was considered blessed, its water capable of washing away lies and revealing truth. If healing was to happen between the two peoples, this was the right place for it to begin. But Running Bear also carried darker knowledge. His scouts reported movement of blue-coat soldiers to the north, more than could be explained by routine patrols. Whispers reached him from other tribes about a new policy from Washington, one that spoke of removal and reservations far from traditional lands. Time was running short for peaceful solutions. "If this council fails," he told his wife Small Moon as they shared their evening meal, "our children may know only the warpath." Small Moon touched the medicine bundle she wore, her fingers tracing symbols of protection and wisdom. "The spirits brought that white child to our warriors for a reason. Perhaps they will bring understanding to this council as well." Running Bear hoped she was right. Tomorrow he would face the white settlers in the sacred circle, wearing the feathers of his ancestors and carrying the hopes of his people. Whatever words were spoken there would echo through the generations, shaping the destiny of both Apache and settler children yet to be born. Martha's hands trembled as she reached beneath her mattress, fingers finding the small tin box she had hidden there since her arrival. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, lay a daguerreotype no larger than her palm. The image was blurred with age and handling, but she could still make out the tiny face of her son, captured in the only photograph she would ever have of him. Little James had lived for only 18 months, but those had been the most precious days of her life. Born in shame but loved without reservation, he had been her secret joy and her greatest sorrow. The fever had taken him so quickly that she barely had time to understand what was happening before he was gone, leaving her alone with grief that threatened to swallow her whole. That was when the darkness had claimed her. In her despair, she had made the choice that haunted every waking moment since. unable to bear the weight of burying her child in the paupers section of the cemetery, unable to face the judgment of the church ladies who had whispered about her unwed state, she had wrapped his small body in her best shawl and left him in the woods outside St. Louis. The memory of that night still woke her from sleep, gasping and clawing at her throat as if she were drowning. She had told herself it was temporary, that she would return when she found the courage. But days had turned to weeks, and weeks to months, and by the time she worked up the strength to go back, there was nothing left to find. "You're looking peaked, dear," Mrs. Morrison observed over breakfast. "Are you feeling well?" Martha forced a smile, tucking the daguerreotype back into its hiding place in her mind. "Just tired. I haven't been sleeping well with all this talk of the Peace Council. It wasn't entirely a lie." The approaching meeting had stirred something deep within her, a restlessness that seemed to grow stronger each day. She found herself thinking about truth and consequences, about the weight of secrets and the courage required to speak honestly. The other settlers had begun to treat her with casual acceptance, no longer watching her with the sharp curiosity that had marked her first weeks in Willow Creek. Sarah Brennan, Tommy's mother, had taken to visiting regularly, grateful for Martha's help with the mending and her gentle way with the children. John Whitman's wife, Rebecca, had invited her to join the ladies' circle that met weekly to work on quilts and share news. But even their kindness felt like another weight upon her shoulders. These good people had welcomed her into their community based on the assumption that she was a decent woman, fallen on hard times. If they knew the truth about what she had done, about the child she had abandoned to the elements, would they still offer her their friendship? Grey Wolf had become a frequent sight around the settlement in the days leading up to the Peace Council, serving as a messenger between the two groups and helping to establish the protocols for the meeting. Martha found herself watching him when she thought no one would notice, intrigued by his ability to move between worlds with such apparent ease. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and a careful way of speaking that suggested he weighed each word before releasing it. Unlike the other Apache men she had glimpsed from a distance, Grey Wolf wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, leather leggings beneath a cotton shirt, his long hair braided with both feathers and metal beads. "He speaks English better than most of us," John Whitman had remarked during one of the planning meetings. "Learned it from missionaries when he was young. Chief Running Bear relies on him to make sure nothing gets lost in translation." Martha wondered what it must be like to serve as a bridge between two such different worlds, to carry the responsibility of ensuring that words meant the same thing to both sides. The burden seemed enormous, and she found herself respecting the quiet dignity with which Grey Wolf carried it. As the Peace Council drew closer, Martha felt her own burden growing heavier. The secret she carried felt like a stone in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She began to understand that some truths demanded to be spoken, regardless of the consequences. The question was whether she would find the courage to speak hers when the moment came. The sacred meeting ground lay in a natural amphitheater, where ancient cottonwoods formed a circle around a spring that bubbled up from deep earth. Smooth stones marked the boundaries of the space, worn by countless seasons and the feet of those who had come before, seeking truth and resolution. At the center of the circle sat the treaty pipe, its carved stem inlaid with turquoise and silver, waiting to be lit as a symbol of binding agreements. Samuel Whitman arrived first with the settler delegation, his best Sunday suit pressed and his beard freshly trimmed for the occasion. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who understood the weight of what they were attempting, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders as he surveyed the sacred ground. "Remember," he addressed the small group of settlers, "we're guests here. Chief Running Bear chose this place, and we need to respect their customs." Martha stood slightly apart from the others, smoothing her dark blue dress with nervous hands. She had chosen her most modest outfit, but even so she felt exposed and conspicuous. Rebecca Whitman offered her an encouraging smile, while Dr. Morrison nodded gravely as he arranged his medical bag nearby, prepared for any emergency that might arise. The Apache delegation emerged from the cottonwoods like spirits, materializing from the morning mist. Chief Running Bear led them, magnificent in his eagle feather headdress, each plume catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves. His face was painted with sacred symbols, ochre and white designs that spoke of spiritual preparation and the gravity of the occasion. Behind him walked his warriors, moving with the fluid grace of men comfortable in their own skins. Grey Wolf walked at the chief's right hand, dressed in traditional buckskins, but carrying a leather satchel that marked his role as translator and record-keeper. His eyes swept over the assembled settlers before finding Martha's face, holding her gaze for just a moment longer than propriety might dictate. The Apache formed their half of the circle with practiced ease, each man taking his designated place according to tribal hierarchy and spiritual protocol. The youngest warriors sat furthest from the center, while the elders and medicine men positioned themselves closer to the sacred pipe. "We gather in this place where our ancestors spoke truth," Chief Running Bear began, his voice carrying clearly across the circle. Grey Wolf translated his words, speaking first in English for the settlers, then repeating the chief's Apache words for those who preferred their native tongue. "The earth beneath us and the sky above us witness our words today. May they be spoken with clean hearts and received with open minds." Samuel Whitman rose slowly, understanding that protocol demanded he respond to the chief's opening. "We come here in peace, seeking understanding between our peoples. We ask for your patience as we try to find a path forward that honors both our ways of life." The formal pleasantries continued for nearly an hour, each side presenting gifts and expressing hopes for the success of the council. Martha watched the careful dance of diplomacy, noting how every gesture and word seemed weighted with significance. But beneath the surface courtesy, she could sense the underlying tensions that had brought them to this moment. When Tommy Brennan's mother, Sarah, stepped forward to thank the Apache warriors who had saved her son, her voice broke with genuine emotion. Swift Hawk, one of the rescuers, nodded gravely and spoke a few words that Grey Wolf translated. "He says the safety of children belongs to all people, not just one tribe." The response drew murmurs of approval from both sides, and for a moment the possibility of real understanding seemed within reach. But then John Hartwell, a settler known for his suspicion of the Apache, stood and began recounting grievances about missing cattle and damaged property. "How do we know these peaceful words match your true intentions?" he challenged, his voice rising with each accusation. "How do we know this isn't just another trick to lower our guard?" The temperature in the circle seemed to drop several degrees. Apache warriors shifted restlessly, hands moving unconsciously toward weapons they had agreed to leave outside the sacred ground. Chief Running Bear's expression remained neutral, but Martha could see the disappointment in his eyes. Grey Wolf translated Hartwell's words carefully, his voice steady but his jaw tight with controlled emotion. The chief listened without interruption, then spoke a few quiet sentences in response. "The chief says that trust cannot be demanded, only earned," Grey Wolf translated. "He asks what proof the white man would accept, since actions have already been dismissed as tricks." The question hung in the air like smoke from the unlit treaty pipe, and Martha felt something stirring within her chest. A recognition that words alone would not bridge this divide, that something more was needed, something honest and vulnerable and real. The fragile peace of the council shattered when Lone Wolf suddenly produced a blood-stained cavalry sword from beneath his blanket, its blade catching the morning light like a mirror of past violence. Gasps echoed from both sides of the circle as he held it aloft, his young face twisted with barely contained rage. "You speak of trust," he said in halting English, his words sharp as broken glass. "But what of this? What of Lieutenant Morrison's promise to protect our hunting grounds? What of his soldiers who came in the night?" Grey Wolf's face went pale as he translated his cousin's words, knowing that protocol had been shattered along with any hope of peaceful resolution. The sword belonged to a cavalry officer who had led a raid on an Apache camp 2 years prior, resulting in the deaths of 3 elders before cooler heads had intervened. Samuel Whitman rose slowly, his hands held open and empty. "Son, I don't know what happened with that sword, but bringing weapons into sacred ground won't solve anything." "Sacred?" Lone Wolf spat. "Nothing is sacred to the white man. You take our land, kill our people, and then speak of peace when it suits you." Several settlers began backing away from the circle, fear replacing their earlier hopes for reconciliation. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, recognizing the sword and understanding its significance. "That belonged to my nephew," he said quietly, "Lieutenant David Morrison. He was court-martialed for those raids and stripped of his rank. The army doesn't condone what he did, but the damage was spreading like fire through dry grass." Apache warriors who had remained silent began voicing their own grievances, while settlers responded with accusations and counter-accusations. The careful structure of the Peace Council crumbled as voices rose in anger, and old wounds reopened. Chief Running Bear stood slowly, his authority evident even in the chaos, but Martha could see that even his wisdom might not be enough to contain the storm that Lone Wolf had unleashed. The unlit treaty pipe sat forgotten as both sides prepared to abandon the sacred ground. "This is exactly what I feared," Rebecca Whitman whispered to her husband. "We should leave while we still can." Martha felt the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs like a physical force. Around her she watched hope dying in real time, watched two groups of people choosing the familiar comfort of hatred over the difficult work of understanding. The blood-stained sword seemed to symbolize everything that kept them apart, all the violence and mistrust that had accumulated over years of conflict. But something deeper stirred within her, a recognition that this moment demanded more than retreat into old patterns. She thought of her son's face in the faded daguerreotype, of the shame that had driven her across half a continent, of the weight of secrets that poisoned everything they touched. The realization struck her like lightning. Peace would never come through perfect people making careful speeches. It would only come through broken people finding the courage to speak their brokenness aloud. If she truly wanted to honor her son's memory, if she wanted to find any meaning in her own suffering, then someone had to take the first step into the terrifying territory of complete honesty. Grey Wolf was trying desperately to maintain order, translating increasingly hostile exchanges, while his own face showed the strain of watching his hopes for his people's future disintegrate. Chief Running Bear spoke sharply to Lone Wolf, commanding him to put away the sword, but the young warrior's anger had reached beyond the reach of authority. "You want proof of Apache honor?" Lone Wolf shouted, raising the bloody blade higher. "Where is proof of white honor? Where is proof that any of your words mean more than wind?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the very possibility of peace between their peoples. Martha felt her legs trembling as she stood, knowing that her next words would either doom the council entirely or offer it the only salvation possible. "I can give you that proof," she said, her voice barely audible above the chaos. But something in her tone, something in the way she stood with her hands clasped before her like a penitent, began to draw attention. "I can tell you something that will prove whether words have any meaning at all," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. "But first, everyone needs to understand that some truths are harder to speak than others, and some truths are harder to hear." Martha reached into her dress pocket with shaking fingers, withdrawing the small wooden cross she had carried since leaving Missouri. She had carved it herself from a piece of oak, whittling away splinter by splinter during the long nights after James had died. It was rough and imperfect, but it had marked his tiny grave before she had lost her courage and abandoned him to the wilderness. "My name is Martha Henderson," she began, her voice growing steadier as the circle fell silent around her. Even Lone Wolf lowered his blood-stained sword, drawn by something in her manner that suggested she was about to strip away more than just words. "3 months ago I came to your settlement running from something I had done, something so shameful that I couldn't bear to stay in the place where people knew me." She held up the wooden cross, its simple lines catching the dappled sunlight. "This cross marked my son's grave. His name was James, and he lived for 18 months before the fever took him." Murmurs rippled through both sides of the circle. An unmarried woman with a child was scandalous enough, but Martha could see in their faces that they sensed more darkness coming. "I was alone when James was born. His father was a married man who wanted nothing to do with us. The church ladies whispered about my sin, and decent people crossed the street to avoid me. But James was innocent of my mistakes, and I loved him more than my own life." Grey Wolf translated her words carefully, and Martha saw Chief Running Bear lean forward, his weathered face showing deep attention. This was not the kind of testimony anyone had expected in a peace council. "When the fever came, I sat by his bedside for 3 days and nights, praying and pleading with God to spare him. I promised I would be better, live better, if only my baby could live. But James died in my arms on a Tuesday morning while the church bells were ringing." Martha's voice broke momentarily, but she forced herself to continue. The wooden cross felt warm in her palm, worn smooth by her fingers during countless sleepless nights. "I had no money for a proper burial. The cemetery wanted payment I couldn't make, and the paupers section was a muddy hole where they dumped the bodies of drunkards and criminals. I couldn't bear the thought of putting my innocent boy in such a place. Rebecca Whitman had tears streaming down her face, while Dr. Morrison sat in stunned silence. On the Apache side, several of the older women nodded with understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. So I wrapped James in my best shawl and carried him to the woods outside St. Louis. I found a beautiful place under an oak tree where wildflowers grew, and I dug his grave with my own hands. I made this cross and planted it at his head, and I promised him I would come back when I found the courage to face what I had done. The wooden cross trembled in Martha's grasp as the weight of her confession pressed down upon her like a physical force. But I was a coward. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and I never went back. I told myself I would return when I was stronger, when I had money for a proper headstone, when I could face the judgment of others. Instead, I ran. I left my son alone in the wilderness and fled west like the coward I am. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Martha felt exposed and raw, her deepest shame laid bare before two communities that had welcomed her without knowing what she truly was. When winter came, I knew the animals would have... She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. I abandoned my own child to save myself from embarrassment. I am the worst kind of mother, the worst kind of woman, and every day since then I have carried this guilt like a poison in my heart. Martha looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of people who had shown her kindness and acceptance, knowing that she had likely destroyed any possibility of their continued friendship. You ask for proof that words have meaning, that honor exists between our peoples. I offer you this. I am a liar and a coward who abandoned her own dead child. If either of your cultures can find room for someone like me, then perhaps there is hope for peace between you. She placed the wooden cross on the ground before her and waited for the judgment that she knew must come. Chief Running Bear rose slowly from his place in the circle, his movements deliberate and full of ceremony. He walked to the center of the sacred ground and spread his ancient storytelling blanket, its intricate patterns woven with threads of many colors, representing the interconnected nature of all life. The blanket had been used by his grandmother and her grandmother before her, reserved for the most sacred moments when truth needed to be shared across generations. Martha watched through tears as the chief settled himself on the blanket, his eagle feather headdress catching the morning light. His weathered face showed no judgment, no condemnation, only the deep concentration of a man preparing to offer something precious from his own experience. "Grey Wolf," he said quietly, "tell the white woman that I will answer her gift of truth with truth of my own." The chief's dark eyes found Martha's face across the circle, and she saw something there that she had not expected: recognition, understanding, and perhaps even compassion. 15 winters ago, Chief Running Bear began, his voice carrying the rhythm of ancient stories. My daughter Singing Bird died of the white man's fever. She was 12 summers old, beautiful as morning sunlight, and beloved by all our people. Grey Wolf translated carefully, his own voice thick with emotion as he recalled the tragedy that had nearly broken his uncle's spirit. When Singing Bird became sick, my wife Small Moon sat by her bedside day and night, just as this woman sat by her child. Small Moon made the same promises to the spirits, offering her own life in exchange for our daughters. The chief paused, his gaze moving to include both sides of the circle in his story. When Singing Bird died, Small Moon's grief was so great that it consumed her mind like fire consumes dry grass. She took our daughter's body and fled into the mountains, saying she would find a place where death could not reach her child. Martha felt her heart stop. The parallel was so exact that it seemed impossible, yet she could see in the chief's eyes that every word was true. For 3 days and 3 nights, Small Moon wandered the high places, carrying our daughter and refusing to accept that she was gone. She would not eat, would not drink, would not listen to reason. The cold and grief nearly killed her. Chief Running Bear touched the sacred blanket beneath him, drawing strength from its ancient patterns. When our warriors finally found Small Moon, she was lying beside Singing Bird's body at the edge of a cliff, both of them nearly frozen. Small Moon had lost her mind to grief, and I thought I might lose both my wife and my daughter to the same darkness. The chief's voice grew stronger as he continued, carrying the wisdom earned through surviving the worst kind of loss. Our medicine woman told me that grief can make people do things that their clear mind would never choose. She said that Small Moon's actions came from love so great that it could not accept the boundaries between life and death. Martha wiped her eyes, beginning to understand that she was receiving something infinitely precious, the gift of shared experience from someone who truly understood her pain. We brought Small Moon home and helped her find her way back to herself. We buried Singing Bird with all the honor she deserved, and we spoke no words of blame for what grief had driven Small Moon to do. Love that deep cannot be called shameful, even when it leads to choices that pain makes necessary. Chief Running Bear stood and walked slowly toward Martha, his steps measured and purposeful. When he reached her, he knelt and picked up the wooden cross she had placed on the ground. "This woman shows courage that many warriors would envy," he said, holding the cross with reverent hands. "To speak such truth in front of enemies and friends alike requires a strength that comes from the deepest places of the heart." He offered the cross back to Martha, but when she reached for it, he closed both of his hands around hers. "Among my people, we understand that the greatest burdens are carried by those who love the most. A mother's grief is sacred, even when it leads her into darkness. The spirits do not judge such love harshly, and neither should we." Martha felt something break open inside her chest, a knot of shame and guilt that had been pulled tight for 3 long years, suddenly beginning to loosen. "Your son is not abandoned." Chief Running Bear continued, "Love like yours follows the spirit beyond death. He knows you carry him with you, and he understands why you had to leave that place of pain." Chief Running Bear reached into the medicine pouch that hung at his side, withdrawing a small bundle of sage and sweetgrass wrapped in soft deerskin. The sacred herbs had been blessed by generations of healers, used to cleanse spiritual wounds and call upon the wisdom of the ancestors. Their earthy scent filled the circle as he held them reverently. "When the body is wounded, we clean the injury and apply healing medicine," the chief said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had served his people as both war leader and spiritual guide. "When the spirit is wounded, we must do the same." Grey Wolf translated with careful precision, understanding that his uncle's next words would either heal the broken council or doom it entirely. "This white woman has shown us the cleanest wound I have ever seen," Chief Running Bear continued. "She has opened her heart completely, holding nothing back, hiding nothing from our sight. This is the courage of a true warrior." He crushed a small portion of the sage between his fingers, releasing its purifying smoke into the morning air. "Among my people, we believe that shame is like poison in a wound. If you do not draw it out and expose it to clean air and sunlight, it will spread until it kills the spirit. This woman has drawn the poison from her own wound in front of all of us. Now it can begin to heal." Martha felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to words that seemed to come from another world entirely, a world where her deepest failure could be seen as something other than unforgivable sin. "But there is more wisdom here than just one woman's courage," the chief said, his gaze sweeping across both sides of the circle. "The spirits have shown us something through her words. They have shown us what real peace looks like." He stood slowly, the medicine pouch still in his hands, and began to walk around the circle, making eye contact with each person present. "Real peace does not come from hiding our worst selves and pretending to be better than we are. Real peace comes from showing our wounds to each other and choosing to heal together rather than die apart." Lone Wolf, who had been silent since Martha's confession, finally spoke. "But uncle, how can we trust people who have hurt us? How can we forget the blood that has been spilled?" Chief Running Bear paused beside his nephew, placing a gentle hand on the young warrior's shoulder. "We do not forget the blood, nephew. We remember it so that we can choose not to spill more. And we trust not because people are perfect, but because they are brave enough to show us their imperfections." He gestured toward Martha, who still knelt in the center of the circle, clutching her wooden cross. "This woman could have kept her secret safe. She could have let us argue and fight and walk away from this council without ever risking her own reputation. Instead, she chose to bleed her own truth in front of us so that healing might be possible." The chief returned to the center of the circle and knelt beside Martha, offering her a pinch of the sacred herbs from his medicine pouch. "Breathe the smoke," he instructed gently. "Let it carry your pain to the spirits who understand suffering." Martha cupped the herbs in her palms and inhaled their ancient fragrance, feeling something shift deep in her chest. The weight she had carried for 3 years seemed to lighten slightly, as if sharing it had made it easier to bear. "Now," Chief Running Bear said, addressing the entire assembly, "who else has wounds that need the clean air of truth?" Who else carries poison that needs to be drawn out before it kills the spirit? Samuel Whitman was the first to respond, rising slowly from his place among the settlers. I have hated all Apache for the death of my brother, even though I know it was only 3 young warriors who killed him, not your entire people. I have let that hatred poison my judgment and make me see enemies where there might be friends. One by one, others began to speak. Dr. Morrison admitted his fear that his nephew's crimes had made him unworthy to serve as the settlement's doctor. Sarah Brennan confessed her relief that the Apache had saved her son, despite her husband's insistence that they should show no gratitude. From the Apache side, Swift Hawk admitted his desire for revenge against all whites for the loss of his wife in a cavalry raid. Even Grey Wolf spoke of his struggle to serve as translator, when he often agreed more with one side than the other. As each person spoke their truth, Chief Running Bear offered them herbs from his medicine pouch, creating a ritual of confession and cleansing that transformed the broken Peace Council into something entirely new, a circle of wounded people choosing to heal together. Grey Wolf produced a water gourd crafted from polished buffalo horn, its surface carved with symbols from both Apache and Mexican traditions. He had made it himself during his time with the missionaries, learning to blend different cultural elements into something new and beautiful. As he poured clear spring water into the vessel, the morning light caught the intricate patterns that told stories of rivers crossing mountains and peoples crossing boundaries. In my grandmother's time, Grey Wolf said, speaking directly to the circle without waiting for his uncle's permission, this gourd would only hold Apache water, drunk only by Apache lips. But I learned from the Spanish fathers that water is the same whether it flows through Apache land or Mexican land or white man's land. He offered the gourd first to Martha, who was still kneeling in the center of the circle, her face streaked with tears, but somehow lighter than it had been in months. Drink, he said gently, let the same water that feeds the earth feed the new understanding growing between us. Martha accepted the gourd with trembling hands, surprised by the simple dignity of the gesture. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of mountain springs and ancient stones. When she passed it to Samuel Whitman, she saw something different in his eyes, a recognition that they were no longer strangers, sharing empty courtesies, but fellow travelers who had seen each other's true faces. The gourd moved slowly around the circle, each person drinking from the same vessel that had touched the lips of their supposed enemies. Dr. Morrison hesitated for only a moment before drinking deeply, remembering that he had taken an oath to heal all people, regardless of their tribe or nation. Rebecca Whitman smiled through her tears as she passed it to Swift Hawk, who surprised everyone by speaking a few words of broken English. Good water, thank you. But it was when the gourd reached Lone Wolf that the true test came. The young warrior held it for a long moment, staring into the clear water as if he could see the future reflected there. My father died fighting white soldiers, he said slowly, his English heavily accented but clear enough. I swore on his grave that I would never trust the white man's words. The circle held its breath as everyone waited to see if the fragile peace would shatter against the young warrior's anger. But this woman, Lone Wolf continued, nodding toward Martha, she spoke truth that could destroy her. Warriors speak of courage in battle, but what kind of courage does it take to destroy yourself with your own words? He raised the gourd in a gesture that seemed half salute and half prayer before drinking deeply. If she can trust us with her darkest secret, perhaps I can trust you with my grief. The gourd completed its circuit and returned to Grey Wolf, who held it up so everyone could see how the water level had dropped as each person drank. See how the water is less, but the vessel is not empty, he observed. This is how peace works. Each person gives something of themselves, and what remains is shared by all. Chief Running Bear nodded approvingly at his nephew's wisdom, then stood to address the transformed council. The spirits have blessed this gathering in ways we did not expect, he said. We came here to speak of boundaries and treaties of cattle and grazing rights. Instead, we have spoken of the boundaries of the heart and the treaties we make with our own conscience. Samuel Whitman rose to respond, his formal bearing softened by the morning's revelations. Chief Running Bear, I came here prepared to negotiate like a businessman, offering land for peace and peace for safety. But I'm beginning to understand that what we're really negotiating is whether we can see each other as human beings worthy of trust. And what have you concluded? The chief asked. Whitman looked around the circle at faces that had become familiar over the course of the morning, no longer the anonymous features of potential enemies, but the specific faces of individuals who had shared their pain and hope. I've concluded that anyone brave enough to bleed their truth in front of strangers is someone I can learn to trust, he said. And anyone wise enough to respond to that truth with healing, instead of judgment, is someone I want as a neighbor. The shared water gourd caught the light as Grey Wolf held it aloft once more, its carved symbols seeming to dance in the shifting shadows. Then let us begin again, Chief Running Bear said, not as Apache and white men, but as people who have tasted the same water and found it good. Small Dove, Chief Running Bear's niece, approached the circle carrying a bundle of different-colored threads and hemp fibers. She was a young woman of 22 winters, known among her people for her skill with weaving and her gentle wisdom that often surprised her elders. Without speaking, she began braiding the materials together, alternating Apache-dyed fibers with threads that the settler women had brought from back east. My aunt teaches that some things can only be made when different strengths work together, she said in careful English, her fingers working the rope with practiced ease. Horsehair alone breaks under heavy weight. Plant fiber alone frays in the weather, but together they hold. Martha watched, fascinated by the young woman's technique. She had learned rope-making from Mrs. Morrison, but this was different, more complex, incorporating knots and patterns she had never seen before. "May I help?" Martha asked, surprised by her own boldness. Small Dove smiled and gestured for Martha to sit beside her. Soon Rebecca Whitman joined them, then Sarah Brennan, curious about the intricate braiding technique. As the women worked together, their conversation flowed naturally from rope-making to child-rearing to the challenges of life on the frontier. "My mother died when my son was born," Small Dove confided, her English becoming more fluent as she relaxed. "My grandmother raised me, taught me that grief and joy often grow from the same ground." Martha's hands stilled on the rope. "You understand, then, about losing someone you love." "I understand that love does not end when breathing ends," Small Dove replied gently. "Your son's spirit knows you carry him with you. That is why you came here today, to honor his memory by helping build something good." While the women worked on their rope, the men had divided into smaller groups, discussing practical matters with a new spirit of cooperation. Samuel Whitman and Chief Running Bear walked the boundaries of the sacred ground, speaking of water rights and grazing lands with the mutual respect that had grown from their morning's revelations. Doak Morrison found himself deep in conversation with the Apache medicine man, comparing techniques for treating fever and infection. Language barriers forced them to resort to drawings in the dirt and pantomime demonstrations, but their shared commitment to healing made communication possible. Grey Wolf served as translator for multiple conversations, but Martha noticed that he spent increasing amounts of time near the group of women working on the rope. When Small Dove sent him to gather more materials, Martha caught him watching her with an expression that made her cheeks warm. "My nephew sees something in you that gives him hope," Small Dove observed quietly, following Martha's gaze. "He has been waiting for someone who understands that bridges must be built with courage, not just good intentions." By midday, the rope had grown to impressive length, its pattern showing clearly how different materials had been woven together to create something stronger than any single component. The women had worked in comfortable companionship, sharing stories and techniques that crossed cultural boundaries. "Look what we have made," Rebecca Whitman said, holding up a section of the rope. "My threads and your fibers, Apache knots and settler techniques. It's beautiful." Small Dove tested the rope's strength, pulling hard against a section where different materials joined. It held firm, the joining point actually stronger than the individual threads. "This is what my uncle spoke of," she said. "When different peoples share their strengths, instead of hiding them, they create something that neither could make alone." The rope became a source of fascination for the entire gathering. Men examined its construction, testing its strength and discussing its potential uses. Children who had been watching from the edges of the circle approached to touch its unusual texture and colors. Chief Running Bear held up a length of the rope for all to see. "This rope will remind us of what we have learned here. When times become difficult, When old fears try to divide us again, we will remember that we have already proven we can work together to create something beautiful and strong." Samuel Whitman nodded in agreement. "I propose we use this rope to mark the boundaries we establish today, not as a barrier between us, but as a reminder of what we can accomplish when we combine our different strengths." As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the rope continued to grow, each new section representing another conversation, another moment of understanding, another small bridge built between two peoples who had started the day as enemies and were ending it as neighbors. The broken arrow appeared at sunset, driven deep into the sacred cottonwood that marked the eastern boundary of the meeting ground. Its shaft had been snapped in half and painted with red ochre, a traditional Apache symbol of war and the rejection of peace. The feathers at its base were burned black, signifying that someone wished death upon the proceedings. Grey Wolf discovered it while gathering firewood for the evening meal that both peoples had agreed to share. His face went pale as he recognized the markings, understanding immediately that not all of his people supported what was happening in the sacred circle. "Uncle," he called quietly to Chief Running Bear, using the Apache word that carried both respect and urgency. The chief approached the tree and studied the broken arrow without touching it. His weathered face showed no surprise, only the resignation of a leader who had expected opposition to any peaceful resolution. "Hawk that strikes?" he asked, referring to a war chief from a distant band who had long opposed any cooperation with white settlers. "The markings are his," Grey Wolf confirmed, "but someone from our own camp must have carried it here. The arrow is fresh cut, and the paint is still wet." Samuel Whitman noticed the disturbance and approached with several other settlers. When he saw the broken arrow, his hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the Apache warriors. "What does it mean?" he asked, though the hostility of the symbol was clear, even without understanding its specific significance. "It means someone wants this peace to fail," Chief Running Bear replied grimly. "Someone believes that cooperation with white settlers is betrayal of Apache honor." As word of the broken arrow spread through both camps, the fragile unity that had been built throughout the day began to show cracks. Settlers gathered in nervous clusters, whispering about the possibility of an ambush. Apache warriors checked their weapons and positioned themselves defensively around their chief. Martha felt the change in atmosphere like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The morning's breakthrough seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by forces that preferred the familiar patterns of hatred and violence. "This is exactly what I feared," John Hartwell muttered to his fellow settlers. "They make pretty speeches while their war parties prepare to attack us in our sleep." Lone Wolf overheard the accusation and stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "You think we planted this warning against ourselves? You think we came here to make peace while planning war? How do we know?" Hartwell shot back. "How do we know any of this isn't just a trick to lower our guard?" The accusations flew back and forth, threatening to undo everything that had been accomplished through the day's painful honesty. Martha watched with growing despair as the two groups began to separate again, old suspicions reasserting themselves in the face of this new threat. But it was Small Dove who stepped forward with unexpected authority, the rope she had been weaving still in her hands. "Look at this arrow," she said, her voice cutting through the rising arguments. "See how it is broken, see how the feathers are burned." She held up the rope beside the broken arrow, creating a stark contrast between the two symbols. "Someone wants us to choose between these two futures. They want us to believe that peace makes us weak, that trust makes us foolish." Grey Wolf translated his cousin's words, but Martha could see that their meaning was clear, even without translation. "But I ask you," Small Dove continued, "which requires more courage? To break something, or to build something? To burn bridges, or to weave them?" Chief Running Bear watched his niece with pride, recognizing in her words the wisdom of someone who understood that true strength often looked like vulnerability. Hawk that strikes believes that showing mercy to enemies makes us weak, the chief explained to the gathered crowd. He sends this broken arrow to remind us that some Apache will never accept peace with white settlers, and some white settlers will never accept peace with Apache. Samuel Whitman added honestly, we face opposition from our own people as well. Martha stepped forward, still clutching the wooden cross that Chief Running Bear had returned to her. The broken arrow represented everything she had run from, all the forces that preferred judgment to forgiveness, destruction to healing. Then we have to decide, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, whether we're going to let the worst parts of our peoples determine our future, or whether we're going to prove that the best parts can be stronger. Martha stared at her reflection in the polished metal mirror that Grey Wolf had given her, a piece of hammered silver that showed her face differently depending on how she held it to the light. From one angle she looked like the broken woman who had arrived in Willow Creek 3 months ago. From another she saw glimpses of someone stronger, someone capable of speaking truth even when it cost everything. The attacks had begun the day after the Peace Council. Not physical violence, but something perhaps more insidious, a campaign of whispers and insinuations designed to destroy the fragile trust that had been built. Decent women don't confess such shameful things in public, Mrs. Hartwell had proclaimed loudly at the general store, making sure her words carried to the customers browsing nearby. What kind of mother abandons her own child's body? What kind of Christian woman does such things? The whispers followed Martha wherever she went in the settlement. Women who had welcomed her into their sewing circles now turned away when she approached. Men who had tipped their hats respectfully now avoided her gaze entirely. Even the children seemed to sense the change, staring at her with curious eyes that held no judgment but reflected their parents' discomfort. Mrs. Morrison remained loyal, but even she struggled with the revelations. I understand grief can make people do terrible things, she said carefully, one evening as they prepared supper together. But Martha dear, why did you have to tell everyone? Some burdens are meant to be carried privately. Martha turned the mirror in her hands, watching her reflection shift and change. Because keeping it private was killing me, she replied simply. And because peace required truth, not just from the Apache but from all of us. The pressure was taking its toll. Martha found herself doubting everything that had happened at the sacred circle. Had Chief Running Bear's wisdom been real? Or had she imagined the acceptance in his eyes? Had the shared water and woven rope meant anything? Or were they just empty gestures that dissolved at the first sign of difficulty? Grey Wolf visited when he could, bringing news from the Apache camp and quiet encouragement that Martha treasured more than she dared admit. But even he faced challenges from his own people. Some of the young warriors say I have been bewitched by white woman's magic, he confided during one of his visits. They claim that your tears have made me weak, that I translate your words too favorably. And what do you tell them? Martha asked, studying his face in the shifting light of the mirror. I tell them that strength comes in many forms, and that the courage you showed in the sacred circle is a kind of warrior's honor they have never tested themselves against. But Martha could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of serving as a bridge between worlds that seemed increasingly determined to remain separate. The situation grew worse when Reverend Patterson arrived from the territorial capital, summoned by concerned settlers who felt their community's moral standards were under assault. He was a stern man with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to weigh souls and find them wanting. This woman has confessed to abandoning a Christian burial for her own child, he proclaimed from the makeshift pulpit during Sunday service. She has admitted to cowardice and dereliction of the most sacred maternal duties. How can we allow such corruption to influence our children and poison our community? Martha sat in the back pew, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. The wooden cross in her pocket seemed to burn against her fingers as the Reverend's words painted her confession, not as an act of courage, but as evidence of irredeemable sin. Furthermore, the Reverend continued, this shameful display at the Apache Council has compromised our position with the territorial authorities. How can we negotiate from strength when we have shown such moral weakness? After the service, Martha found herself standing alone outside the church while families gathered in clusters that pointedly excluded her. The mirror in her pocket caught the afternoon sunlight, throwing brief flashes of brightness across the dusty ground. Miss Henderson. The Reverend's voice behind her was cold and formal. I think it would be best for everyone if you considered relocating to another settlement. Your presence here has become divisive. Martha turned to face him, the mirror warm in her hand. In its polished surface, she could see both the judgment in his eyes and something else, fear. Fear that forgiveness might be more powerful than condemnation, that healing might be more transformative than punishment. Reverend Patterson, she said quietly, I understand your concerns, but I'm not leaving. This community needs to decide whether it believes in redemption or just talks about it during sermons. The talking stick that Grey Wolf and Samuel Whitman had carved together bore symbols from both cultures: Apache thunderbirds intertwined with settler crosses, mountain peaks rising beside wheat sheaves. It had taken them 3 evenings to complete, working by firelight while their respective communities slept, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture, but somehow to both. Martha held the stick now as she stood before an emergency town meeting, feeling its smooth weight and drawing strength from the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. The settler families had gathered in the schoolhouse, faces grim with the kind of determination that usually preceded difficult decisions. I know why you've called this meeting, Martha began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Reverend Patterson has made it clear that my presence here is considered a moral threat to your community. John Hartwell stood immediately, his face flushed with righteous anger. You confessed to abandoning your own child's body to wild animals. How can we trust someone capable of such an act? How can we let our children see such behavior without consequences? But before Martha could respond, Dr. Morrison rose from his seat near the back of the room. John, I'd like to ask you something, the doctor said calmly. When your youngest boy broke his arm last winter, who sat with him through the night while I set the bone? Who sang to him when the pain made him cry? Hartwell's face showed confusion at the change of subject. Martha did, but I don't see what that has to do with. And when the Brennan family had the influenza, who risked her own health to help nurse them back to wellness? Dr. Morrison continued. Well, Martha, and when old Mrs. Patterson needed someone to read to her during her final illness, who spent hours at her bedside offering comfort to a woman she barely knew. The doctor's questions were creating a different picture than the one painted by the Reverend's condemnation. Other voices began to join in, hesitant at first, but growing stronger. Martha taught my daughter to read when the schoolmaster was away, said Rebecca Whitman quietly. She never asked for payment, never made Sarah feel ashamed for being behind the other children. She helped me deliver my calf when it was breached, added young Thomas Fletcher, saved both the mother and baby. Sarah Brennan stood slowly, her face showing the internal struggle between social pressure and personal gratitude. When Tommy went missing, Martha was the first person to offer to join the search party. She walked the creek bed for hours, calling his name until her voice gave out. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. And when the Apache brought him back safe, she was the one who suggested we should thank them properly instead of treating them like threats. Martha felt tears prick her eyes as story after story emerged, people recounting acts of kindness and service that she had performed without thought of recognition or reward. The talking stick seemed to pulse with warmth in her hands, as if the symbols carved into its surface were coming alive. Mrs. Morrison stood next, her voice carrying the authority of the settlement's matriarch. I've lived in this community longer than most of you, and I've seen plenty of people who talk about Christian charity, but practice something quite different. Martha Henderson has lived among us for 3 months, and in that time she has shown more practical love than some folks show in a lifetime. Even some of the men who had been most critical
began to shift uncomfortably, forced to confront the disconnect between Martha's confessed past and her observed behavior. But it was when Grey Wolf himself appeared at the schoolhouse door that the meeting took an unexpected turn. He waited respectfully for permission to enter, the talking stick in Martha's hands seeming to grant him that right. "Forgive interruption," he said in his careful English, "but Apache people have decision to share." Samuel Whitman gestured for him to continue, understanding that whatever Grey Wolf had come to say would affect the entire community. "We hear of your meeting about Martha who speaks truth. Chief Running Bear sends message." Grey Wolf paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "Apache Council has decided, if white settlement sends away the woman who showed courage in sacred circle, then Apache people know white words about peace are lies." The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. The fragile peace they had worked so hard to build would collapse if they exiled Martha. Furthermore, Grey Wolf continued, "Apache people offer Martha place in our camp if her own people cannot see her worth. We judge person by their courage to speak truth and their actions after speaking. By these measures, she would be welcomed as sister." Martha stared at the talking stick in her hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected support from people she had feared would condemn her. The braided horsehair bracelet that Grey Wolf placed around Martha's wrist was a work of art that spoke of cultures learning to dance together. Black horsehair from Apache ponies, intertwined with brown hair from settler work horses, bound together with sinew and silver wire, using techniques from both traditions. Small beads of turquoise and bone marked the joining points, creating a pattern that was neither fully Apache nor fully white, but something entirely new. "Among my people," Grey Wolf explained as he secured the bracelet with careful fingers, "such gifts are given only when the heart speaks louder than the mind." They stood together in the evening light beside Willow Creek, the water flowing past them with the same endless patience it had shown for countless generations. Martha had come here to think and pray after the tumultuous town meeting, and Grey Wolf had found her watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Your people offered me sanctuary," Martha said softly, turning the bracelet so its pattern caught the fading light. "I never expected such kindness from strangers." "Are we still strangers?" Grey Wolf asked, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "After sharing the sacred circle, after drinking from the same water, after building peace together with our words and hands." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the weeks since the Peace Council, Grey Wolf had become more than just a translator and messenger. He had become her confidant, the one person who seemed to understand both her past shame and her hopes for redemption. "Grey Wolf, I don't know if it's wise for us to," she began, but he gently placed a finger against her lips. "My English name is David," he said quietly. "The missionaries gave it to me when I learned their language. But you are the first person I have wanted to share it with." The revelation felt intimate, more personal than any words of affection. Martha understood that he was offering her a piece of himself that bridged his two worlds, just as she had bridged hers by speaking her truth, the sacred circle. "David," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name. "It suits you, and you," he said, touching the bracelet on her wrist. "You are becoming someone new as well. Not the woman who ran from Missouri in shame, and not just the woman who confessed in the sacred circle.
Someone who chooses courage every day, someone who builds bridges instead of walls." Their hands found each other as naturally as streams find rivers, fingers intertwining with the same gentle strength that characterized everything about their growing relationship. But even in this moment of tenderness, Martha felt the weight of the challenges they would face. "David, you know the difficulties we'll encounter. My own people barely tolerate me now, and some of yours see me as a symbol of unwelcome change. Some difficulties are worth facing," he replied, lifting their joined hands to show how the bracelet caught the last rays of sunlight. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest trees grow in the places where different winds meet." They walked slowly along the creek bank, talking in the careful way of people discovering they share the same dreams. David spoke of his vision for a future where Apache and settler children might learn from each other, where the best of both cultures could flourish together. Martha shared her growing sense that her confession had not been an ending, but a beginning, the first step toward a life built on truth, rather than hidden shame. "I need to tell you something," Martha said as they paused beside a fallen log that served as a natural bridge across the creek. "About my feelings for you." David waited patiently, understanding that this was another moment of truth-telling that required courage. "I'm afraid," she continued, "that my reputation will taint you, that loving me will make your own people question your judgment." "Let me ask you something," David said gently. "When you spoke your truth in the sacred circle, did you do it because it was safe, or because it was necessary?" Martha smiled, recognizing her own wisdom reflected back to her. "Because it was necessary." "Then you understand why I choose to love you, despite the difficulties. Not because it's safe, but because it's true." He removed a matching bracelet from his own wrist, one that complemented hers, but was clearly crafted for masculine hands. The pattern was similar but reversed, showing that they belonged together while maintaining their individual identities. "Will you accept this gift?" he asked formally, "as a sign that two people from different worlds can create something beautiful together." Martha took the bracelet with hands that no longer trembled, slipping it onto his wrist with the confidence of someone who had learned that love, like peace, required the courage to believe in possibilities that others considered impossible. The sacred fire had burned continuously for 7 days and nights, its flames fed by both Apache cedar and settler oak, tended by members of both communities who had taken turns maintaining the eternal vigil. But now the fire flickered dangerously low as riders approached from the east, their dust cloud visible for miles across the valley floor. Chief Running Bear stood beside the fire pit, adding carefully selected pieces of wood to keep the flames alive. The fire represented the fragile peace that had grown between the two peoples, and Apache tradition held that if it died before the formal treaty was signed, the agreement would be cursed. Cavalry Samuel Whitman announced grimly, lowering his spyglass after studying the approaching riders. 2 companies at least, flying territorial colors. Martha felt her heart sink as she watched the distant figures resolve into uniformed soldiers. For weeks, the Peace Council had been working toward a formal agreement, creating boundaries and protocols that would allow both peoples to share the valley. But the arrival of territorial troops suggested that outside forces had decided to impose a different solution. Grey Wolf translated rapidly for his uncle, and Martha saw the chief's jaw tighten with controlled anger. This was exactly what he had feared, that their local success would be overruled by distant authorities who preferred military solutions to diplomatic ones. "What do we do, Doctor?" Morrison asked, speaking the question that hung in everyone's mind. Chief Running Bear looked around the circle at faces that had become familiar over the past weeks. Apache and settler families had grown accustomed to sharing meals, trading goods, and solving problems together. Children from both communities played the same games, using words from both languages. The thought of returning to the old patterns of suspicion and hostility seemed almost impossible. "We stand together," the chief said simply. "We show these soldiers what we have built here, and we make them understand that peace is stronger than war." But Martha could see the doubt in people's eyes. Military authority carried weight that moral arguments might not be able to overcome. The territorial government had made no secret of its preference for removing Apache populations to distant reservations, freeing up land for increased settlement and development. The cavalry column reached the edge of the meeting ground just as the sun began to set, their arrival timed for maximum psychological impact. Major Harrison Wells dismounted with crisp military efficiency, his uniform immaculate despite the long ride. Behind him, 2 companies of soldiers arranged themselves in formation, a show of force designed to remind everyone present of federal authority. Chief Running Bear Major Wells announced formally, By order of the territorial governor, you and your people are to report to the Apache reservation at Fort Sumner within 30 days. Gray Wolf translated the ultimatum, but his uncle held up a hand to prevent any immediate response from his warriors. Major Wells, Samuel Whitman interjected, stepping forward with careful diplomacy. We've been working on a local agreement that benefits everyone involved. Perhaps we could discuss, Mr. Whitman, the major interrupted. The territorial government appreciates your efforts, but local agreements cannot supersede federal policy. The Apache will be relocated for their own protection and the security of increased settlement. Martha watched the sacred fire flicker as evening winds stirred the flames. Everything they had built through weeks of painful honesty and careful trust-building was being swept aside by distant decisions made by people who had never shared water or woven rope together. But it was Chief Running Bear who provided the first surprise of the evening. "Major Wells," he said in clear English, having learned enough of the language to speak for himself, "we refuse your order." The simple statement sent shockwaves through both the military formation and the gathered civilians. Apache bands that resisted relocation typically faced military action, and everyone present understood the implications of the chief's words. "Chief," Major Wells replied with the kind of patience used for children and fools, "you don't understand the consequences of refusing federal authority." "I understand perfectly," Running Bear replied, gesturing toward the mixed gathering around the sacred fire. "These people are my neighbors now. This valley is our home together. We will not abandon what we have built." Martha felt David's hand find hers as they stood together, facing the most serious test their fragile peace had yet encountered. The sacred fire burned between them and the soldiers, its light creating dancing shadows that seemed to flicker between hope and despair. The treaty document spread across the makeshift table was unlike any official paper the territorial government had ever seen. Written in both Apache symbols and English words, it bore the signatures and marks of every family from both communities, including children who had added their handprints in colored clay. The paper itself had been made from pulped plants that grew in the valley, bound with fibers that both peoples considered sacred. Martha stood beside the table as Major Wells examined the document with obvious skepticism. Around them, the entire community had gathered in protective formation, Apache warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with settler farmers, their wives and children intermingled in a human wall that spoke louder than any words could. "This is not a legal document," Major Wells announced after reviewing the treaty's unconventional format. "Federal law doesn't recognize local agreements that contradict territorial policy." "Major," Samuel Whitman replied firmly, "with respect, this community has found a solution that works for everyone involved. These Apache families are not threats to our settlement. They're our neighbors, our trading partners, and our friends." Martha watched as Dr. Morrison stepped forward, carrying his medical bag and wearing the confidence of a man who had treated patients from both communities. "Major Wells, in my professional opinion, forced relocation would be a humanitarian disaster. These people have adapted their traditional lifestyle to coexist peacefully with agricultural settlement. Tearing them away from their support systems would cause unnecessary suffering." But the major remained unmoved. "Gentlemen, I understand your local perspective, but my orders are clear. The Apache will be relocated to prevent future conflicts and enable orderly territorial development." That was when Martha realized that words alone would not be enough. The military mind understood only force and authority, not the subtle bonds of trust and mutual respect that had been built through shared vulnerability. Someone needed to speak in terms that Major Wells could not ignore. "Major," she said, stepping forward with the treaty document in her hands, "before you implement your orders, I need to inform you of something that might change your understanding of the situation." The major turned to her with barely concealed impatience. "Ma'am, unless you have federal authority to countermand territorial orders, I'm not sure what you could possibly tell me that would matter." Martha felt David's encouraging presence beside her and saw Chief Running Bear nod slightly, giving her permission to speak for all of them. Major Wells, what would you say if I told you that this Apache band has been secretly protecting settler interests for the past 6 months? The Major's eyebrows rose slightly. I'd say I would need significant proof of such a claim. Martha gestured to Grey Wolf, who produced a leather pouch filled with detailed maps and written reports in both Apache pictographs and English text. These documents detail the movements of Hawk That Strikes and his war band, including planned raids on 3 different settlements in the territory. Chief Running Bear's scouts have been tracking them and providing warnings to territorial authorities through unofficial channels. Major Wells examined the documents with growing interest, his military training allowing him to recognize the strategic value of the intelligence they contained. Furthermore, Martha continued, this community has developed agricultural techniques that increase crop yields by 40% compared to standard territorial farming. We're producing surplus food that could feed military installations throughout the region. She was stretching some truths and adding others, but Martha understood that the Major needed to see practical benefits that justified maintaining the current arrangement. And finally, she said, playing her strongest card, any attempt to forcibly relocate this Apache band will result in every settler family in this valley relocating as well. We've become economically and socially integrated. You cannot remove one without destroying both. Samuel Whitman caught on immediately to Martha's strategy. That's correct, Major. We formally request territorial recognition of our community as a joint settlement, with both Apache and settler families holding equal legal status. The Major stared at the treaty document with its mixture of languages and symbols, clearly calculating the political implications of what he was being asked to consider. You're asking me to contradict direct orders from the territorial governor. We're asking you to recommend a more effective solution, Martha replied. A solution that achieves territorial goals without destroying a successful example of peaceful coexistence. Chief Running Bear added the final weight to their argument by speaking directly to the Major in carefully practiced English. Major Wells, we offer partnership, not resistance. We offer knowledge of this land and protection of your people. Is this not more valuable than empty reservation where we become burden on government supplies? The treaty document lay between them, its handmade paper catching the firelight, as both communities waited to learn whether their courage would be enough to preserve what they had built together. The wedding blanket that covered Martha and David's joined hands had been woven by women from both communities, its intricate patterns telling the story of 2 peoples who had learned to see strength in their differences. Apache geometric designs flowed seamlessly into settler floral motifs, bound together with threads dyed in colors that had no names in either language alone. At its center, worked in silver and turquoise thread, was the symbol of Willow Creek itself, the place where 2 streams became one river. 6 months had passed since Major Wells had agreed to recommend their joint settlement for official territorial recognition. The recommendation had been accepted, making their community the first legally recognized integrated settlement in the territory. More importantly, it had given other communities hope that peaceful coexistence was possible. Martha stood beside David in the same sacred circle where she had first confessed her darkest shame, but now the space was transformed by flowers from both Apache and settler gardens, filled with faces that had become beloved rather than merely familiar. Chief Running Bear held the traditional Apache blessing, while Reverend Patterson had traveled from the territorial capital to offer Christian prayers. The Reverend had been transformed by his time among the integrated community, his rigid certainties softened by witnessing daily acts of forgiveness and practical love. He had requested permission to stay for several weeks, studying what he called the theology of redemption lived out in daily practice. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying genuine warmth instead of his former stern judgment, we gather today to witness something miraculous.
Not just the union of two hearts, but the living proof that love can indeed overcome the barriers that fear and hatred try to build between us. Small Dove stood beside Martha as her sister by choice, while Samuel Whitman served as David's witness, their friendship having grown from mutual respect into genuine affection. The entire community had participated in preparing for the ceremony, sharing tasks and traditions without regard for which culture they originally belonged to. Mrs. Morrison had worked with Apache women to prepare a feast that combined the best foods from both traditions. Children from both communities had gathered wild flowers and woven them into garlands that now decorated the sacred space. Even the music blended Apache drums with settler fiddles, creating rhythms that belonged fully to neither culture, but somehow to both. As the ceremony proceeded, Martha found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The shame that had driven her west had been transformed into strength that now anchored an entire community's hope for the future. The wooden cross she had carved for her son's grave now rested in a place of honor in their shared chapel, where both Christian and Apache prayers were offered for healing and guidance. "Do you, Martha, take David to be your husband?" Reverend Patterson asked, in all the complexities and joys of building a life that bridges two worlds. "I do," Martha replied, her voice carrying across the circle to every person who had become part of her extended family. "I take him as my partner in creating something new and beautiful from the love we share." When David spoke his vows, he used both English and Apache words, his promise echoing across the valley where their children would grow up, knowing that differences could be sources of strength rather than division. Chief Running Bear blessed their union with sacred smoke, while Reverend Patterson offered prayers of future together. The wedding blanket was wrapped around their shoulders as a symbol of the protection and warmth their community would always provide. As the celebration continued into the evening, Martha and David walked hand in hand to the edge of Willow Creek, where the water continued its eternal flow toward distant seas.
The valley spread out before them. But mostly I think about how much beauty we would have missed if we had chosen to remain strangers, if we had let fear keep us separated. Above them, the stars shone down on a valley where children played games that used words from many languages, where gardens grew foods from different traditions, and where the impossible had become simply the way things were when people chose love over fear, truth over comfortable lies, and hope over the easier path of despair.